What's up, everyone? It's James from Project Past, and if you're watching this, it is your lucky day because you're about to watch the first episode of Project Past's History Unscripted series. Found a pretty cool spot that I didn't really know a whole lot about, so it was a good place to start this series. Learned a lot, and I hope you will too. So with that being said, enjoy. So when you think about early exploration and colonization of North America, I'm sure several places come to mind. Some people may think of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. Some people may think of Jamestown or even Roanoke. If you're like me, you think of St. Augustine, which even bears the title of nation's oldest city. But what if I told you in 1564, a full year before the Spanish landed in St. Augustine, the French landed in Florida and set up a settlement? Where that settlement is, you may ask? Well, it's on the banks of the St. Johns River, just outside of downtown Jacksonville. And that settlement was called Fort Caroline. Now, I gotta be honest, up until a couple months ago, I didn't even know Fort Caroline existed. I came across its story online doing some research, and I inadvertently found a connection between Fort Caroline and where I live in St. Augustine. And the story was pretty cool. And there's also some controversy that goes along with Fort Caroline. But before we tour the replica of Fort Caroline and the visitor center, we're gonna go ahead and start here. And this is called Ribault's Monument. So we're making our way up these steps that I'm trying really hard not to trip over to see Ribault's Monument. If you don't know who Ribault is, Jean Ribault was a French navigator who is said to have landed here in 1562. Probably a little closer to where the St. Johns River meets the Atlantic Ocean. This isn't the original marker that he placed. This is a replica. Unfortunately, the original was lost to time and Mother Nature. Okay, so here is the replica of Jean Ribault's marker that he would have placed upon his landing. Like I said, he probably landed a little closer to the Atlantic Ocean. This is the St. Johns River, or at the time called the River of May. They believe he called it the River of May because he landed here on May 1st. But upon placing this marker on his arrival, he essentially claimed France's slice of the New World in Florida. So I don't know if you can read that, but this says, this is a replica of the marker placed on or near this spot by Jean Ribault, May 1st, 1562, in taking possession of Florida for France. Pretty cool. So this is the St. Johns River. When he landed, he called this the River May, or the River of May, most likely because he landed in this area on May 1st. Shortly after Ribault erected this monument, he made a pretty smart move, and he befriended the Timucuan Indians, which were very prevalent in this area. As some of you may know, the Native Americans were vital to these early settlement success. A lot of times their very survival depended on that. So after he established this marker, he befriended the local Timucuan Indians, and it is said after that he sailed up the coast of what is now Georgia and South Carolina. He did establish a temporary fort called Charles Fort in South Carolina, but after a month or two, they had to abandon it and return to France. So that was pretty cool. Good little slice of history there. So now we're going to head over the visitor center, which is right around the corner, and also see the replica that they built of Fort Caroline. So we're here now in the visitor center, and they start off by going over the local environment. It's a pretty swampy area, but they also give you a pretty good insight as to what wildlife and what the tides were like here as well. Also a lot of oyster shells in this area, which provided a good amount of food And also they even built shelters out of these things, which is crazy to me. So this guy here is super cool. The park ranger, who's been great so far. He told me that this is a 900-year-old totem pole that was found in this area. It was preserved in these swampy lowlands here. And once it was excavated, it dated it back to about 900 years ago. So that's really cool. Now this is another artifact that was found in the area. It is a canoe. Again, the swampy lowlands here did a very good job of preserving this. This is super cool. They literally just hollowed out a tree and it floated. If you don't know by now, the Native Americans were extremely resourceful and they truly did live off the land. These are just some of the examples of things they made just by what they found in their area. And it is Shark Week starting today, so luckily this guy isn't around anymore. I don't think you want to get bit by this thing. Now we're moving on to the Timucuan Indians, to now the first encounters with Europeans. Really cool. Something kind of unrelated and in a different time period. The 54th Massachusetts, which you may have heard of, which is a all-African American unit in the Civil War, took part in an engagement nearby. The Battle of St. John's Bluff. Now, one of the things that the Timucuan Indians first noticed is how Europeans dress for battle. You can see we have a shield here, a helmet, and a breastplate, which I'm sure wasn't light. Black powder and musketry was still in its infancy around this time, but it was becoming more common. Here's another pretty cool piece. 1594. Recovered from a wreck from a Spanish galleon near Vero Beach. Really cool. So we're leaving the visitor center now, which was packed full of information, some pretty cool artifacts. Learned a few new things, especially about the 54th Massachusetts during the Civil War. Didn't know that they even made it down this far, and had a little dust up with the Confederates, that Battle of St. John's Bluff. But right now we're headed down to the replica of Fort Caroline, which is about a third of its original size. Walking out to the fort, and they have what a Timucuan village may have looked like. And again, another example of them being resourceful. Looks like we have what a hut may have looked like, and the beginnings of another one of those canoes. So in the beginning of the video, I touched on that there was some controversy surrounding Fort Caroline. And that controversy is no one really knows the exact location of the fort. Now, the consensus is that it was in this general area, just outside of Jacksonville, along the banks of the St. John's. There actually is several theories stating that it wasn't even in Florida at all, that it was in what is now southern Georgia. Now, there are several factors contributing to the fort's unknown location. Part of the reason why, when the Spanish attacked Fort Caroline, they burned it to the ground. And obviously, this was uncharted territory for these European nations. So maps would be highly inaccurate. For instance, once the Spanish settled in St. Augustine, they thought the whole east coast of what is now the United States was Florida. So we briefly touched on Jean Ribault's landing here in 1562. Well, he left, and in 1564, he would return with René Laudonnière and a bunch of French Huguenots, which were essentially religious refugees. There was a lot of political unrest in France at the time, and French Huguenots were pretty big targets. So in many ways, this was the first settlement in America based on religious freedom. So they would land here in 1564, found that marker, and they would establish Fort Caroline. Now, things would be tough for them that first year, even with the Native Americans' help. With anything, not everyone agreed on everything, and several mutinous parties left Fort Caroline in search of fame and fortune. Well, as fate would have it, the Spanish would capture some of these mutineers, and they learned of Fort Caroline. Now, upon learning about Fort Caroline, this obviously didn't sit well with Spain, because they were pretty entrenched in Central and South America, and a lot of their trade routes ran along what is now the Gulf Stream. So we're approaching the replica of Fort Caroline now, and they just go into a little bit of the construction of it. Something that stood out to me was the first guardhouse they built was blown over by wind. I guess they built it too high. That's not good. Well, like we talked about, the first year life was tough here. But in August 1565, they got some relief. They were getting ready to abandon this colony. And in August, French ships arrived with supplies and more men. So here's the front gate of Fort Caroline. Like I said, this is a replica, and it's about a third of the size that it would have been. You can see they got a moat here. So we're walking through the front gates of Fort Caroline, and we just briefly touched on the relief expedition that arrived here in 1565 that delivered fresh men and supplies. Well, upon hearing this, the Spanish were not too pleased. One, because they saw this as a direct threat to their stake in the New World and their supply routes and trade routes. And they also weren't pleased that French Protestants were in the New World. So shortly after hearing about Fort Caroline, the Spanish dispatched a man called Pedro Menendez from Puerto Rico with about 7 or 8 ships. He would sail up this way and actually meet Jean Ribault's fleet just off the coast of where we are in Jacksonville. They had a brief little dust up, very minor. The French ships retreated back to Fort Caroline up the river, and Pedro Menendez and his fleet would sail south and land in a little place, and they would establish a base called St Augustine. Now, Jean Ribault, upon hearing the Spanish landing in St Augustine, was not pleased. He saw the Spanish as a direct threat, just like the Spanish saw the French as a direct threat. Sorry, words are hard sometimes. So he gathered his men, loaded up about 7 ships, and despite Laudonnière urging him not to sail because we're in the middle of hurricane season in Florida, he headed towards St. Augustine. Well, as luck would have it, he would hit a hurricane and it would scatter his fleet, sink some of his ships, and the rest of the survivors would swim to shore on what is now Daytona Beach. Now, those survivors would begin working their way back north to Fort Caroline. And we're going to cover what happened to those survivors in a later episode, so stay tuned. Now, I'm no expert, so I'm not sure if this was just pure luck or if Pedro Menendez knew of the French fleet sailing towards his location. Well, either way, he and his army gathered and they marched north by land through that same hurricane, and they would camp somewhere back in here. This is called the Spanish Pond. So if you've ever been to Florida, you know that it can get pretty swampy in some areas, and this vegetation's pretty thick. Now imagine walking through this in a hurricane and then camping and then launching an assault in all that armor that we did see in the visitor center, but they would have come from this way and made their way to Fort Caroline. Now, like I said, this is about a third of the size, so the fort would have been much larger. Now, once the Spanish launched their attack, they found a meagerly defended Fort Caroline, since all their soldiers were scattered along the east coast of Florida. Well, they were able to move up these walls pretty easily, and unfortunately ended up being a massacre. Pedro Menendez was a pretty brutal guy, especially if you weren't Catholic. So about 130 to 150 people were massacred. Now, a small contingent of women and children were spared, and Rene Laudonnière, who was the governor of Fort Caroline, was able to escape along with his personal topographer. So this is pretty much covering the massacre that would end up taking place here. Kind of give you a brief synopsis of it. Massacred about 130 people. And here's a drawing of the Spanish inside Fort Caroline. I'm assuming that would be Pedro Menendez. And on the bottom, kind of give you a brief little timeline from the Spanish discovering the French fleet delivering supplies, the French attempting their strike at St Augustine, fortunately only hitting a hurricane, and then Pedro marching north to our location. And you know the rest. Now, as with most early settlements, they usually built them next to waterways. Obviously there were no highways back then, or roads, especially this was uncharted territory. So rivers are the lifeline. So you'll see a lot of these early settlements near rivers. Here's the French delivering some fresh supplies, Fort Caroline. Little late, little late. So this would be the center of the fort, which we read about that guard tower that they built too high, was blown over. But that would be right in this general area. So this is pretty cool. It may be hard to see with the shadows, but it's a board describing some of the settlers that live here. Oftentimes in history, the key role players we know a lot about, but the people that actually resided here we really know little about. But with this board, you can kind of see some of the people. Bring it into focus here. Aymon was a French soldier who sailed with Ribault in 1562. Now this one's kind of interesting. Pierre Gambray, he was killed by two Indians in a canoe while he was fishing, which is interesting because we've learned that they had a pretty good relationship with the local tribes here. Pretty cool. A lot of these stories here. So before we leave, I wanted to show you this because this is something I did not know. Now, Spain would burn Fort Caroline to the ground and they would erect their own fort here. But the French would have their last laugh, because in 1568, they would return and burn the Spanish fort. So that was pretty cool. When you think about the early history of America and the first few settlements, you don't really think of North Florida as being a hotspot. But as we just learned, it kind of was, for at least for a time. It's also crazy to think that a hurricane could have changed the fate of history and pretty much ended France's foothold in Florida. Really an unfortunate set of circumstances. But like I said, that was pretty cool. Learned a lot. Hope you did too. Hope you enjoyed it. And we're going to cover what happened to Ribault's fleet in a later episode. So be on the lookout for that. Take care.